Is chosen intentionally by people who want to have a spiritual practice, who are willing to make a commitment to do practices beyond the normal practices of the Islamic religion. People who are seeking an experience of the divine. It has 14 centuries of experience behind it. 14 centuries in which people who were householders, people who carried on in responsible professions, nevertheless sought spiritual attainment within the context of everyday life. So Sufism as a spiritual path has always been a path very integrated with everyday life. It has existed in all Islamic cultures. Nowadays, it is spread throughout the world. So in Sufism, we have a whole spectrum of practices, from meditation, chanting, the whirling ceremony, which is particular to our particular order. There is hospitality, there is art, music. It touches every aspect of life. Today, our subject has to do with how the spirituality, and how Rumi in particular, might inform our humanness. We're living at a time when humanness is more and more challenged. In fact, I think this is one of the sort of crucial challenges of our time. And I think you people, many of whom are engineers or engineers in training, you are facing a highly technologized world, a world in which technology can, in some respects, overwhelm our more human side. So for this reason, I'm particularly pleased to have a chance to speak with all of you today. In Sufism, there's this extraordinarily exalted idea of what a human being is. Not in the sense of us being superior to the rest of nature in such a way that we have a right to control it and exploit it. On the contrary, in the teachings of Islam, the idea of balance is essential. That nature is like a book to be read, and that the best state is the most balanced state. And the human being is here to be a representative of the divine, a caretaker on this planet. And yet, at the same time, what we have within ourselves is like a hologram of the whole universe. The holographic idea, which is easily accessible to people these days, actually has been an aspect of Sufism, a teaching of Sufism, for all of these centuries. For instance, the great Turkish poet Yunus Emre says something like, "You are not the drop that will merge with the ocean. You are the drop that contains the ocean." So there is as if a sample of everything in the universe contained within the human being, particularly within the human heart. I'd like to make a distinction between the material world, or the world of senses, which is perceived through measurement and analyzed through mathematics, which scientists and engineers know very well, and another dimension of reality, which is the dimension of consciousness, of this individual personal experience of the conscious human being. And this conscious human being, which hopefully we all are, has a capacity to experience a dimension of reality that is a dimension of values. And what I mean by values, let's start with relationship. What healthy human being, what healthy, sane human being doesn't desire a relationship with other human beings, with animals, potentially with nature, and we would say ultimately with something called the divine. It's the human heart that is the cognitive instrument for perceiving values and what is of value, what truly matters, what at the end of the day, at the end of life, will have truly mattered. Is it friendship? Is it a sense of personal integrity? Is it the love we shared with families and loved ones? Is it the beauty of the particular field we're devoted to? There's beauty in art, and there's also beauty in science. But the beauty of science is not the mathematics on the page. It is not the measurements of the galaxies. It's an experience within the human being's own personal experience. So the Sufi, the mystic, is someone who is seeking to enhance that experience, to develop it, and to develop it through an awakening of consciousness. So the human being, every creature of nature, including the human being, has unique capacities. And by the way, in my talk today, I'm going to avoid using the G word, that is the God word, if you will allow me, because I know that word has a lot of baggage, and you may have an allergy to it. Worse yet, you may think you know what it means. Instead of the word God, I'm going to use a synonym, maybe more than one synonym, but I will mostly use a synonym, the real, or the most real, or the truly real. So this is what we mean by the divine. We mean what is truly, fundamentally, essentially real. So here's a little bit of poetry from Rumi. Poetry is the language of the soul and the language of the heart. You can say things with poetry that you can't say as beautifully and as meaningfully with prose. Because poetry is a way of saying one thing and meaning another. And to talk about this spiritual dimension, we need metaphors, because that dimension is an invisible dimension. It's invisible, but it's real. It's experienced by the heart. It's experienced in our inner life. And it is, these experiences come in relationship to things in the tangible world, but the experiences themselves are invisible and personal. These distinctions may seem very elementary, but I want you to keep them in mind because they're going to be very, very important. And we can hold in mind that there are simultaneously these two dimensions. And poetry, while speaking about the tangible world, is often, through metaphor, speaking about something intangible, invisible. Sufis often call the most real the beloved or the friend. This is how we refer to the divine very often. And I'm not just, by the way, making up this synonym, because the word haq in Arabic and Persian and other languages, it literally means the real, the truth. And haq is the most common synonym for the divine in Sufi literature, in fact, in Islamic literature. so common that very often translators won't even bother to translate haq as the real. They'll just use the G word, which is a mistake. I can say, as a translator, something important is lost. Well, now switching to the poetry, not everybody can apprehend poetry through the ear, but bear with me. I'll try and share things that are fairly straightforward. This is a short selection, and these translations are our own. I've titled this A Knowledge Like Light. What the real taught to the bees doesn't belong to the lion or the wild ass. The bees make a home of juicy sweetness. The real opened the door to that knowing. What the real taught the silkworm, does any elephant have such expertise? Adam, the first human being, Adam, though made of earth, was given knowledge by the real. A knowledge like light, a knowledge that pierced the seven heavens, the levels, all levels of reality. So it's part of the teaching of the Quran that the divine, the most real, instills the knowledge necessary in every creature. And in fact, there's a whole chapter in the Quran called the bees, in which it is described that the bees received inspiration from God. And with that inspiration, they knew how to make honey, they knew how to make their honeycombs, and they made this golden liquid that is a healing for humanity. So it's a beautiful example of how knowledge, inspired knowledge, a knowledge like light, comes into the world and produces something really miraculous. But what was given to the bee, or the elephant, or the lion, is only a portion of what's given to the human being. And what's given to the human being is what we're going to try to talk about today. Rumi says, and this is from one of his discourses, it's not poetry, it's prose. He says, a human being is a great thing. Everything is inscribed within the human. But veils and obfuscations prevent him or her from reading the knowledge we have within ourselves. These veils and obfuscations are the various preoccupations, the worldly strategies, the many desires. Yet despite all these things that lie hidden in the darkness behind the veils, the human being does manage to read something and to be aware of what he or she reads. Consider how aware he becomes and what knowledge of himself he discovers when the veils are lifted and the darkness is dispelled. All manner of trades like tailoring, building, harvesting, engineering, goldsmithery, astronomy, medicine, ad infinitum, have been discovered from within the human being, not from under rocks and mud clumps. It is said that a raven taught man to bury the dead. This is, according to Islamic lore, it was when Cain killed Abel, Cain saw a crow digging in the earth and burying another crow, and man received the knowledge of burial from witnessing that in nature. We know, for instance, that indigenous peoples have an extraordinary knowledge of thousands of plants within their environment, and they know the purpose of every one of these things. And people wonder, well, did they discover this through trial and error? How many centuries did it take them to figure all this out? And we would say, according to our understanding, that no, that knowledge is inherent in us, that the human being is a portal to infinite knowing, And incredible things can be discovered from within ourselves, to the extent that we remove the veils that are obscuring our own inner knowledge. Rumi's main concern was sharing with human beings what he perceived as the beauty, the intelligence, the generosity of the most real. He was intoxicated with it at a certain stage of his life. He opened up to it through an amazing mentor relationship, a relationship with a mentor, that is, who sort of blew his mind, blew the roof off of his house. And Rumi became, afterwards, a poet, an ecstatic. He left for a while, his profession as professor, and he became a bit of a wild man for a while. His heart was so opened that he just began to flow with this extraordinary poetry, and this continued throughout his life. And he left for us a body of work that is really unmatched by any writer in the field of spiritual literature. Some 40,000 lines of inspired work. So Rumi was drunk with something. He was drunk with his experience of the real. And the spirituality that he embodied and taught, and which has continued as a living tradition ever since, is a spirituality that seeks to unite the human being with this source of infinite beauty, generosity, knowledge, and countless other beautiful attributes. Here's a little bit more poetry from Rumi. He says, "What the real spoke into the ear of the rose made it laugh and burst into bloom. What it spoke to the stone made it a ruby. What the real whispered to the body filled it with spirit. It sang to the sun, and the sun became radiant. Consider what it must have chanted into the ear of the cloud that caused it to rain profuse tears upon this earth." And then in this poem, he talks about how sometimes we find ourselves in dilemmas. Do I choose this or do I choose that? What's the best way for me? A religious person might say, what is the will of God? Shall I do this or shall I do the opposite? We often find ourselves in that situation. Then Rumi begins to talk about inspiration with the idea that if we lift those veils, if we clear those distortions from the mirror of the heart, from the mirror of consciousness, then something extraordinary is possible. He says, what is inspiration? A kind of speech the senses can't perceive. The spiritual ear and eye are different from the bodily senses. The ear of thought and mere opinion have no part in it. And then he says, and this is a bit of a subtle concept, I'll give a little commentary. He says, to be under the compulsion of love is to be free. Other loveless compulsions are like chains. You know, we human beings fall under compulsions, desires, habits, addictions, and so forth. And those kind of compulsions are chains. But he says love's compulsion isn't compulsion. When a human being comes under the inspiration of love, the most real, when we come under that compulsion, so that in a sense we can only do what love impels us to do, that is union with God. It is the moon merging, it is the moon emerging from behind the clouds and radiant. The human being who has reached that state. So there's so many practices in this spiritual tradition. But let me just give you one, something very practical, doable. It is a practice for the remembrance of God. Oh, should have said the remembrance of the most real. I slipped. Remembrance is the foremost practice within Sufism and within Islam. The Quran says, truly, remembrance is the greatest. And what we mean by remembrance is the capacity of the heart to sense that we live in a spiritual reality. The heart can know this. I hope each of us have known moments when our heart sensed a presence, a kind of sense of order, meaning, purposefulness in life. Sense the reality of a unity, a beauty, a generosity that allows us to feel as if we're loved and as if our lives have purpose and meaning. The practice of remembrance is a practice that we consciously undertake. And one of the ways that we do it is simply through the breath. In the simplest way, we could say, with every exhalation, allow yourself to be emptied of your preoccupations, your fears, your random desires. Just empty, empty, empty with every exhalation. And with every inhalation, know that you're receiving the presence of the real. Emptying with every exhalation, awakening into presence with every inhalation. Now, within the Islamic framework, we could use a phrase which is La ilaha illallah. This is the fundamental truth, revelation of Islam. And it means, La ilaha means there is no God, small g. Illallah, but God. There is no God but God, meaning there is no God, there are no gods, but that which is truly divine. And all the things that the human ego puts in the place of the most real, all of the idols that egoism creates, idols of celebrity, idols of power, idols of self-importance, idols of materialism, etc., etc. These are to be washed away, cleared from the mirror of the heart, cleared from our souls, and to return again and again to there is no God, there is no truly real, but the real. And the real is not defined, it's not turned into a dogma, it's not even explained. It's for the heart to know that, for you to know that. And worship, the only true worship, is to sit yourself to the best of your ability in front of the most real, to clear your mind of unnecessary thoughts and your heart of random desires and emotions, and simply be there in presence. So presence is another fundamental concept. the ability of the human being to comprehensively be here with full attention, with presence of heart. So the Sufis have all kinds of methods for cultivating remembrance. And in our particular lineage, we are the lineage of the Whirling Dervishes, which began in roughly the 13th and 14th centuries in what today would be the region of Turkey. And it involves a whirling meditation. We're called the Whirling Dervishes. And this practice of whirling is the human being moving around the single axis of the left leg with arms outstretched, poised, balanced, in such a way as to be drawn into our inmost center. Because to be able to whirl in that way, you have to be free of thought inwardly. You have to empty yourself. And because not only are you needing to be aware of your own balance and your posture, but also your relationship to other people in the ceremony. There's a very complex ceremony which has a cosmological dimension and which is supported by an orchestra of classical musicians and has given birth to a very refined tradition of classical music. And this was one of our foremost forms of worship, which is also remembrance. The intention is to open ourselves to the real by coming to our inmost center, where we're closest to the real, and doing it in a way that is beautiful, inspiring, supported by music and by the voices of a chorus singing. And we're going to share with you for a few minutes today a video recording that was done a couple of years ago in Istanbul. It is the Mevlevi Sema, that's what it's called. Sema means the time of listening, audition, listening with the heart. And here I am leading this ceremony with another Turkish sheikh. And you'll see the dervishes, you'll see this beautiful ancient hall that we're turning in that's several hundred years old. You'll have a little bit of the music. And we're jumping in late in the ceremony, we're jumping in the point of the ceremony where there are two sheikhs on this particular occasion, because I was in Turkey and I wanted to invite a local sheikh to be with me in this ceremony so that we could share an American and a Turk in this tradition that is developed in Turkey over 7 centuries. So, Nanshla, can we run this? And I'll tell you when is enough. And if you could give it good full screen would be great. There it is.
Let me know if the volume is working.
Okay, Nechla, we'll pause it there. Thank you. That's Sema, and it was offered weekly in a Sufi lodge, a Mevlevi Sufi lodge. And there were hundreds of Mevlevi Sufi lodges all over the Ottoman world up until the early 20th century. And then the traumas and catastrophes of the 20th century changed a lot of things. But the tradition has been revived. And now you can find it in Louisville, and you can find it in Switzerland, and you can find it in India, and you can find it in Indonesia, as well as Turkey and other countries. So, remembrance, presence, this is what it's all about. And the purpose of presence and remembrance is to be able to have a relationship with this source of infinite intelligence, an intimate relationship from within the depths of one's own heart, where that presence is closest to us. And through that relationship, to, well, to be guided and inspired by the knowledge that is like light, to know what we truly carry within ourselves, what is the reality, the inner reality of the human being. Our tradition has very little dogma. It has a lot of poetry. It has some very refined metaphysical conceptions, but it has no dogma in the sense of things you must believe. It's not about belief, it's about experience. And what I hope to be doing today, we are doing this. I'm not hoping to express and make clearer the universal dimensions of this great tradition in a way that may be applicable in your lives. And I think if you can keep these ideas of presence, first of all, presence being a comprehensive awareness, which we in a way seldom are in that state of presence. But when we are in that state of presence, thought, feeling, bodily movement, sensory information is all held within a single field of awareness. And also the state of the heart is within that awareness. It is close to mindfulness, I would say, which is now a common practice. Sometimes it's reduced to little more than stress reduction. But presence is something, it is a portal through all that is valuable in human experience. If we could, at this moment, and let's do it right now, bring your awareness to your breath. Know that you're breathing. Now have a sensation that you are embodied. You're breathing. Can you feel your body? Sense your body. So there's breath, there's bodily sensation. Can you be aware of your thought, if any thought comes and moves through your consciousness? And can you at the same time be aware of your emotional state at this moment? Maybe it's relatively peaceful, whatever it is. Maybe it's happiness. Maybe you're carrying some sorrow. It doesn't matter. Don't judge it. Aware of your emotional state. Conscious enough to be aware of thoughts but not to be distracted by them, aware of your breath, aware of your body. This is presence. To cultivate it as a way of life is the Sufi way. That presence will eventually lead us to an experience of knowing that this presence is not sourced entirely within myself. It doesn't originate with me. It is, in a sense, something flowing to me from an infinite source of presence. Presence of the most real. So there's this relationship. Presence can awaken in me because I've opened a portal to that infinite presence. And knowing that and sensing the presence of that infinite presence is the beginning of remembrance. It's the beginning of the realization that it's possible to have a relationship with a source of qualities, of virtues, of strengths, of energies, of everything we need to live this life abundantly, creatively, and humbly. We open up to the spiritual dimension of reality, and in that dimension is where we find strength, peace, generosity, courage, forgiveness, everything that is worthwhile, everything that is most desired by human beings, all of which are invisible. All these things I've named are entirely invisible, and what is most important in life is invisible. Your love, your friendships, your own sense of integrity, your aspiration, your creativity. These are contained within this marvelous something called the human being, the drop which contains the ocean. But there's also something we also have to reckon with, and here's another poem of Rumi's, and it's about the necessity of presence. Rumi says, "Oh, most real, what a helper you are. Hear and respond to the cry of those in difficulty. O truth, there are so many traps, so many baits, and we are like hungry, greedy birds. Every moment we're caught in some new snare. Even when we might become a falcon, a bird of the heavens, we are caught in one trap after another. But oh, you who are without need, each moment you free us again and again, and still we fall into traps. We put our grain into our barn and then lose it. Why don't we consider that this loss comes from the gnawing of mice? These little mice have ruined the grain in our barn. O soul, first stop the mischief of the mice, then work to gather the grain. Hear this saying of the Master of Masters, Muhammad: no prayer is complete without presence. If there is no thievish, mischievous mouse in our barn, where is the harvest of these 40 years of devotion? Why doesn't the sincerity of each day accumulate bit by bit here in this barn? Rumi had a gift for expressing profound ideas in the most common, earthy metaphors. So we are like a barn in which we try to store our grain. We've been harvesting the grain, but we've ignored the nibbling, gnawing mice that are in the barn. It's our presence that is needed. And he's also quoting Prophet Muhammad, who said, in Islam, praying 5 times a day is recommended. And yet, if that prayer is performed just merely as a ritual, as something to get done and get it over with, out of fear that we'll be punished if we don't do the obligatory prayer, it's of very little value. The Prophet Muhammad himself said, there is no prayer, or prayer is not complete without presence. Life is not complete without presence. Relationship is not complete without presence. And presence is enhanced by remembrance of the most real. So, in a nutshell, that's Sufism, with some particular poems by Rumi. Rumi is not the originator of Sufism, he's just one great figure in a great tradition who expressed these truths, the truths of the human situation, with such genius, with such clarity, in ways that even a child could understand. So I will pause here, and I would love to have some conversation with you. Please don't be shy or don't think your questions are not appropriate. Whatever's on your mind is appropriate.